I'm interested in the reduction in food production that you talked about that happened, and whether you think that is a direct link to the reduced population, or whether there was something else affecting agriculture, either a loss of a sort of knowledge, a skills base, or disease.
My colleagues at UCL have just published a paper suggesting it might be to do with a climatic downturn around 3700 BC. And although we don't really see the effects until 300 years later, they argue that it's basically once the knowledge is lost in the extreme conditions, it's never the technology is never regained. I'm not sure I buy that one. We've also got evidence coming out from ancient DNA that populations in Central Europe, and it's these ancestors, ultimately the bell beaker, that they are affected by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that we know as the Black Death or the plague, though it hadn't undergone the genetic mutation that later made it so deadly. I think its technical term is pneumonic plague. Nonetheless, for populations that had never come into contact with it, it would have been, for example, as devastating as, say, measles and smallpox were to Native Americans. So that's another possibility, though the earliest date for that is not before 2900 BC in in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Another possibility is that the long-term farming cycles that we're seeing of these early Neolithic farmers didn't include enough instilling of fertilizer back into the ground, so that they're on long cycles of ultimately causing infertility, so that what starts off as really good agricultural land gradually, generation after generation, imperceptibly to the living population, declines to the point that it makes it no longer sustainable. It has been noted that as agriculture moved across Europe, roughly 700 years after its arrival in each region, there seems to be something of a bust after the boom. So that's another interesting aspect to feed into the equation. As yet, I don't think we've got any sense of which is the key variable, but of course it could be aspects of all of those that led to such events.
Is there a connection between the sites like Brodka and the sites here? Because the Brodka one has residential sites adjacent to it. Is there anything like that associated with? They also had cremations on Lewis. Is there a sort of pattern to the circles down the country?
I think one of the interesting things that we found at Stonehenge was its close relationship with Darrington Walls, the great henge that had formerly been a village. And that realisation has now taken place in different parts of the country, including Brodgar, where we have the very famous Nissa Brodgar within a mile or so of the circle. And Nick Card, who's been excavating there, has very much drawn on our results and said, wow, we've got the same thing here. Other archaeologists have noted similar relationships from Scotland to southern England to North Wales in the area of Bangor, for example. So yes, my guess is somewhere in the Nevern Valley or environs there has to be such a site. I suspect, though, that we already know where it is, and that it is Bank D. The reoccupation of that site around 3000 BC, the causeway enclosure. What Jeff and Tim discovered was that that's a timber monument. Up on the bank, there were post holes. They couldn't be entirely sure with which phase those post holes went. That's something that requires research in the future. But if some of those, and there's certainly one of those post holes appears to be in the later stage of the bank, which would suggest it went with the recutting of the ditch around 3000 BC. I wonder if we've got the same sort of arrangement as we identified at Darrington Walls, where we had basically a place of the living in wood, place of the ancestors in stone. So that's where my money would be. And that's, whereas the river seemed to be the divider for Darrington Walls and Stonehenge, I wonder if it's the Preseli Ridge here, because they're both positioned on high points, but below the ridge itself. So, yeah, that's all for the future. A fascinating possibility.
Thank you. Given the amazing coincidence in the size and design of these circles,
Yes.
do you think it's possible there was a band of itinerant master masons wandering around the using the indigenous population to do the hard labour?
Oh, Bill, you yes. Well, I wonder, I mean, a lot of people draw the parallel with cathedrals versus parish churches. And in fact, it was John Aubrey who said, Avebury is a cathedral and Stonehenge a mere parish church by comparison. And if you think about how cathedrals were built, and in some cases, I think, as I understand, it's only reading historical novels, but I think there is evidence that you did get masons travelling from one cathedral construction to the next. I think we're looking at a country that's much more joined up, and of course that was the other side of the Neolithic Brexit, is that we're seeing, and I didn't mention this, we see the decline in the regionalism of the pottery styles and the burial sites. So, whereas there had been cromlechs or portal dolmens in the west and long barrows in the east, those sorts of divisions broke down at this point. So we get the exotically named Peterborough ware, which is then found throughout the east and the west. That is then replaced by grooved ware, which we think originated in Orkney and has spread throughout Britain. We've known that early dates around 3000 from the Stonehenge area. So I think it's realising, and of course the other thing is the homogeneity of the architecture. The house plans we recovered from Darrington Walls at Stonehenge, you could basically match with those at Skara Brae and Orkney. The only difference was in Orkney they had to be built of stone because they'd already chopped down all their trees. So it's that realisation that they're working to a kind of a lifestyle that wherever you went, you would have felt at home, you would have been familiar with the houses, where you sat within a house, what you did within a house, the monument types. So the cursus monuments of the Middle Neolithic are much more extensive than the causeway enclosures. We find them right up into Scotland, right into Wales as well, for example. So yes, in a sense, you could have master megalith makers travelling round, but I think it's also part of a growing commonality that's being shared throughout the island of Britain at that time.
Wasn't it a magical significance to the bluestones? Why go to all the trouble to bring those stones?
Yeah. I think the problem with the stones at Stonehenge is that there are so many different types. 15 different kinds, according to Richard Bevins and Rob Ixer. That, some are sedimentary, and then all these different kinds of volcanics. Some of the volcanic ashes, there's a sort of calcareous one, for example, they're really very unimpressive. I think to suggest that there's some sort of common feature about the stones themselves, I think it's more important about where they're from. One of the really interesting things we've discovered excavating at Carngoedog and Craig Rosavellin is the number of radiocarbon dates on charcoal from the Mesolithic period. That these were spots that were clearly visited at many points before Neolithic arrival. So I think it's very possible that for the indigenous hunter-gatherer population, they may have had a significance. It could have just been as good places to wait for animals to be hunted. But it may be that this is something that was picked up by the Neolithic population, that these are rather special points. So yeah, I think it's more than the stones themselves that's at stake here. But who knows? Yeah.
The way the stone fractured at Geodog seems to me to be very rectangular or flat compared to what the Ross Valley or elsewhere.
Yes.
do you find that that type of stone is elsewhere in the landscape? In other words, do you find geoduck stone elsewhere?
You mean pillar formations? Yes.
Well, yeah.
Yes, but yes. So the nice,
Yeah,
the nice
very-
rectangular
very-
sort of pillars.
Yeah.
Now and again, and for many years, geologists have been looking at places like Carnalu and suggesting that the rhyolites of Stonehenge came from Carnalu. And it's only recently that the geologists, Richard and Rob, have shown that Carnalu has nothing to do with bluestones. But go and look at Carnalu and you see that it's completely the wrong type of stone because it's much more bulky and blocky. So, I think they're definitely searching out what you might see as more elegant shapes. And so they're being quite picky, and there are certain places where they occur in profusion. There are, of course, other places, and who's to know whether some are simply scavenged. We've all walked across this landscape and thought, oh, that's a rather nice, pillar-like stone, and of course, in the last couple of 100 years, farmers have been particularly interested in collecting nice ones to put up as their gateposts. So, and we know that from the Bronze Age onwards, there's a fascination in putting up standing stones. Yes.
What about cremation? Was that carried out after stone circles, or were they cremated elsewhere? And
All the evidence we have is that stone circles are sometimes used as places of deposition, where someone's cremated ashes might be buried. Not always, and where we've been able to carry out the analysis is at Stonehenge. There's no evidence that they were actually cremated there, but were actually brought from elsewhere. And one of the studies that has been done on the cremated remains of Stonehenge has shown that that people were being, you can measure the isotopes of oxygen in those burials, and the suggestion that the variation relates to the density of forest which derived the wood for the cremation pyres, to suggest that they're actually being cremated in landscapes of varying forest density, which is quite intriguing. Cremation had become almost universal by 3000 BC across Britain. Inhumation virtually disappeared as far as we can tell, largely confined to sub-adults, children. There are circular crematory grounds where you have a ditch and bank. So basically cremation enclosures that we're finding throughout Britain from this period. It'd be interesting to know if there are any in this area. We've never been able to find them. But my guess is quite probably somewhere. But yes, it had already become the dominant rite at this point.
Because there was cremation on Lewis, wasn't it? The stone circles on Lewis had remains.
Not quite, but others do. Yes. So, for example, Balburney in eastern Scotland, you have a little stone circle with cremated remains. Ken Papel, similarly. Yes. Yes, Callanish has a tune in the middle of it. But yes.
Can I ask what is the latest thinking on how they cut stone up in Nesselbog or up in Orkneys?
Well, my colleague, former team member Hugo Anderson Wymark, who's now got a job with the National Museums of Scotland, did a little TV cameo where they split some of the big sandstone blocks, and he did it very simply with an antler mallet and wooden wedges, and he showed that within a matter of minutes you could actually detach substantial monoliths from the bedrock.
But you've got doorways, haven't you, that have been cut out, and then a 2-ton door plonked on a you know,
On
the
a
ball
pivot.
bearing
Yes, yes,
thing.
yeah.
I mean,
Mm.
if it's going to take 9 months to cut a front door for your house,
Yeah.
you know, it obviously was a faster process.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah, we don't think they're making the doors out of stone, although, as you're quite right, they have lentils. They do seem to have been wooden, but the actual business of building the houses, yes, it's quite sophisticated. Coming back to the ring of Brodgar, the thinking is that from the different types of stones, so one of the interesting things about the big stone circles is they invariably have stones drawn from different sources. And the suggestion by Colin Richards is that Brodgar Ring is built with stones brought from different parts of Orkney, so that there's one sector that's responsible by one group, another sector by another.
Where you've been excavating this last week or so, it's quite a slope on that ground. Whereas sort of naive people like me who always expect a stone circle to be fairly level.
Mm.
Do you have any
Go and take a look. I've spent 3 weeks up there, and what's really struck me is it's actually a slight dome, and the 100 metres or so actually at various points perfectly follows the top of the break of slope. And so no, it's not really, I don't see it as a slope, because as I said, it's a saddle which then rises up like so. And of course the views are extraordinary, because we actually saw Snowdonia for a brief moment a couple of weeks ago. We didn't see it this time, but from the circle you can also see Ireland. And interestingly enough, if you go over to the Causeway enclosure on the south side, you've got this extraordinary view over the southern half of West Wales. You can even see Lundy from there too. So between the two sites, there is a sense of total surveillance. And you can imagine that gathering places like that would have had a profound reach that's demonstrating a substantial hinterland over which they had control.
Are you coming back again next week?
At the moment, I'm thinking I just want to go home. As you probably be able to tell, I've developed a terrible cold. My back's killing me. I've got arthritis in my hip. We've worn out the students. So, would you like me to come back then?
Please.
So, I'll see if we can muster the strength to do so. Yes, there's always more to be done. So various people have said, you haven't looked in the middle of it. Of course we haven't. There are obvious things that need to be done. And I think this intriguing business of if it was unfinished, that really makes it unique. Because as far as we can tell, all of the other great circles were completed or substantially completed. And that raises interesting issues about what causes a circle not to be finished. Do some groups who are responsible for certain parts of it say, well, we're not playing anymore, we've got other plans? Or is it something rather darker, some kind of act of subjugation? Anyone who knows the Geoffrey of Monmouth legend, which I'm sure you all do, that Merlin sends 15,000 men to Ireland, to the mountain, to the stone circle on the mountain, to take it away. So, could it have aroused somebody's anger far, far away, who said, we're going to take them out and demolish their stones and make them really pay by taking them away in tribute, or whatever.
Well, they were trying to build a stone circle themselves and thought that these would be very useful.
Maybe, yeah.
They stopped paying the master masons, so they went somewhere else and left them.
That's right. Yeah. Let down by the builders. That's never happened to anyone, has it?
Okay, well, I think we'll be leaving to close there. So I'd just like to thank you one more time for coming. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yes.
Okay, well, everybody, I hope you all have a safe